joining our webinar today. We're going to give a few more minutes for folks to continue to join, and we should get started in 2 or 3 more minutes. Thank you. And I think we'll give it 1 more minute, and then we'll get started. Jared, you ready?
I am. Thank you, Dave.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, if you're on the webinar, if you could mute your mic if you're not talking, that'd be appreciated. Thank you. All right, I think it's go time. I think we'll get started. Jared, if you could start recording.
Yep.
Okay. Let me know when you got it.
It's going.
Oh, it is. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, hey, hello everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today on our Informative Fridays. This is Dave Thomas. I'm Vice President of Sales for Bales, and I wanted to take a second and just introduce the topic of today's webinar. And I'm on premise. Why do I care? And an overview of InforOS and LDAP-S. This session will start with a brief overview of 2 important new technologies for on-premise clients, LDAP-S and InforOS. For each, we will address benefits and potential pitfalls and help define a general scope as you plan for these projects. Since the LDAP to LDAP-S switch will be required by Microsoft, this webinar strongly suggests for any clients choosing to remain on version 10 for the near term. But before we get started, and if you're familiar with Bales, I'd like to take a second and tell you a little bit about us. We've been in the Infor ecosystem for over 26 years, and we're entirely Infor-focused organization. We do nothing but Infor implementations, upgrades, and managed services. We support all aspects of the technology, including S3, Landmark, and Cloud Suite, including HCM, Finance, and Supply Chain suites, as well as Burst and other technologies available to Infor customers. In fact, we've been recognized and given partnering awards in 8 out of the last 10 years. Bales is also one of the only women-owned businesses supporting the Infor S3 and Landmark products, and we're really proud of that. Our consultants bring 15+ years of consulting experience in the space and the equivalent in professional experience. Some were former benefits managers, compensation managers, directors of supply chain, as well as former controllers and CFOs. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and let me introduce you to your presenters. Jared Brock and Rob Velasco. Guys, take it away. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Hey, everybody. I'm Jared Brock. I'm a technical practice manager at Bales & Associates, and I've also got Rob Velasco here with us, who is also a technical practice manager at Bales. Our technical group is a rascally bunch, so I like to think we run it a bit like Sparta with 2 kings. And I hope between the 2 of us we can give you a good overview of what's going on with LDAP-S and InforOS today. And I'm going to run through this presentation, but I'm going to try to leave a good amount of time at the end for some questions and some discussions, because I know that these 2 topics they do have a really important time horizon on them, which we'll get into. And so I think there's a little bit of urgency, and again, that's why we've got Rob here to hopefully help address some of those questions at the end. So here's the agenda today. First, I want to talk about LDAP to LDAP-S. why it's important and why it's important now. And the easy answer to that is because Microsoft. Like Dave said in the beginning, Microsoft has issued what they call an advisory. That's basically just a message from them that they intend to make a significant change to their product, which in this case is Microsoft's Active Directory lightweight directory services, which a lot of you, if you're on V10, are using as your LDAP provider. And we'll talk about what that process looks like and what you need to consider if you're thinking about moving off of LDAP ahead of the timeline, or if you're concerned about making that timeline. Then we'll talk about InforOS and why that's important and why that's important now. And that actually just took on an even greater sense of urgency in the last couple of weeks after I had put together a lot of information for this presentation. And that's important now because of Infor. Infor has started to notify some of the single tenant hosted clients who are on V10 but are hosted by Infor that they're going to start moving their Ming.le 11 products up to InforOS, up to the latest version of InforOS. So that has a real impact for anybody who's still, or anybody who is single tenant hosted on V10. And there's plenty of great value and benefits there. If you are completely on premise, you're self-hosted, but still on V10, I think InforOS is a great value, and I'm going to get into some of the reasons why I think that's true. So let's get started. So LDAP to LDAP-S. Before I go and talk through too much of this, I do want to make a caveat here. This section is really applicable only for those who are using Microsoft's Active Directory lightweight directory services. I know that's a mouthful. A lot of us just call it AD/LDS, but that's Microsoft's LDAP product. Some of you who are on premise may be using IBM's LDAP product called Tivoli. The urgency here doesn't apply to those people using Tivoli because that's a different product. Microsoft has no sway over what happens in IBM world. But moving to LDAP-S is still something you could do on Tivoli if you have any security concerns. And that's really where Microsoft is coming from here with this change. LDAP alone is a somewhat unsecured protocol, and they want to move to LDAP-S to secure that. So it's going to make a little more sense as we look at the architecture of what your environment probably looks like. And this is mostly true. This figure is mostly true whether you're completely on premise or whether you're single tenant hosted. So what's the LDAP? The LDAP's this guy here, and it's where user security and information gets stored. So when we think about loss and security, or security roles or classes, or securing access to particular data, or provisioning users with particular access, in LSF, all of that is stored in the LDAP. So it's a really important piece of the environment because without the LDAP, there's no other authentication that can happen in the environment. There's no authentication, there's no authorization. And so the LDAP provides a methodology for authenticating into Lawson environments. So beyond just being able to be a repository for saying what XYZ user has access to, in the Lawson System Foundation environment, the LDAP also provides a model for actually authenticating into that environment. So in most cases, there are some technical caveats, but we don't really have to get into them here. In most cases, when you go log into your Lawson portal and you put in your username and password, that's going directly against your LDAP to authenticate that username and password and see if that matches what's actually in the user repository. And when it makes that call, it uses the LDAP protocol to talk between your data areas and your product lines, your WebSphere application server, and your LDAP. So these two loopy arrows here on the right, these are where you're making LDAP calls. And Microsoft's concern is that those calls are not secure. There's known vulnerabilities in them, and they're not secure. And they haven't been for a very long time, but Microsoft now is putting a sort of a hard stop on letting those vulnerabilities stick around. So I like to think of LDAP. I think the easiest way to think of LDAP is as a protocol. And I think a lot of you probably are familiar with the difference between HTTP and HTTPS when you go access a web page. HTTPS means that it's secured HTTP. And that secured means that it's encrypted by an SSL certificate chain that the client and the target server share. And so that call is encrypted. LDAP-S is the same way. It's the same protocol. It just has an encryption layer added onto it provided by an SSL certificate chain. Now, in a lot of cases, from the Lawson System Foundation perspective, our LDAP is on the same server as the rest of our system foundation. So it's not like we're making these calls across a public internet, but in some cases, for some clients and some other products that are using LDAP, Microsoft's LDAP, they are making those calls across the public internet. And so that's why Microsoft is pushing this change to LDAP-S. So Lawson System Foundation is sort of an unwilling victim in that change, but luckily, what we have to do to fix this is not too terribly complicated. So like I said, what's happening to ADLDS? Microsoft has issued advisory 190023, and you can go look this up. And that's saying basically in a lot of legalese that they will be moving to an LDAP-S only configuration to enhance security at some time in 2020. They actually originally issued this bulletin last year, and they were supposed to move to LDAP-S only in the beginning of 2020. Obviously, COVID hit, that changed the timeline a little bit. Now they've tentatively pushed it back to I believe their words actually are sometime in the second half of 2020. We're getting pretty close to that time running out. I anticipate they might push it again until maybe next spring, but probably not much further than that. So InforOS suggestion is, let's go ahead and get you on LDAP-S so that this isn't something that slides off your radar. And you apply system patches, or your system engineers or server teams apply system patches, and one of those patches contains the patch to ADLDS to move this up to LDAP-S. If that happens and you haven't already switched, LSF will fail to start. Your users will not be able to authenticate. You won't be able to get into your system. So it's a relatively small change that needs to happen, and it's definitely easy to prepare for, but it's something that you don't want to let fall off your radar and forget about, and then have Microsoft come in next year and kind of push this patch without much more fanfare and have it kind of slide under the radar and cause you problems. So let's talk about what it looks like to actually make this change and make this update. Like I said, the only real difference between LDAP and LDAP-S is that LDAP-S is secured with SSL certificate chain. And what that means is that in order to establish that chain, that security layer, you're going to have to generate SSL certificates. That's going to be a little bit different for each client. Some clients can, have in-house certificate generation teams or server teams that are in charge of that and can make internally signed certificates that are very secure and work in your organization. Some clients choose to purchase third-party certificates as an easier way around that. Doesn't matter which way you go, but you do need to generate specific SSL certificates that will be compatible with ADLDS and the server that you're putting these certificates on. And then those certificates need to be installed into ADLDS, they need to be installed into WebSphere, and they need to be installed into the OS Java, basically the three different components that are going to be making calls back and forth. And for those of you who are heavily on the technical side, you'll know that the Lawson environment uses calls to the LDAP through the OS Java. So that's why the OS Java gets included in there as well. Then once those certificates are in place, you're going to have to update LSF and or Landmark and IFS if you're also using those to utilize LDAP-S as the protocol for connecting to the LDAP. So why do you have to update those other tools if LSF is really the one talking to the LDAP in most cases? For most of us who are still on V10, we tend to use Lawson System Foundation as the primary authenticating server. Well, you need to update Landmark and or IFS if you have that, because those two are still making LDAP calls through Lawson System Foundation to that LDAP. So, and they're making LDAP calls and not LDAP-S calls. So those need to be updated as well. But the key thing and what usually causes the most problems is generating the right SSL certificates and getting those in the right places. That's still a little bit of a confusing world for especially smaller clients who don't have big IT departments with teams dedicated to managing SSL certificates. So that's where we find most of the stumbling blocks, is just making sure that the guidelines from Infor are followed in generating and requesting these certificates and then installing them in the right way and the right places. Making the changes in your LSF environment actually is pretty painless and requires very little downtime. You're just going to do, in most cases, you're just going to need to do a recycle of the environment, which for most of you takes less than 30 minutes, start to finish. So take a look at that article from Microsoft. Take a look at, there are a couple knowledge base articles from Infor that are out there. Infor has released a couple notifications via email blasts. Take a look at those. This is definitely an easy thing to get ahead of, and you can do this at any time. There's no reason to wait, but you don't want to let this sit on the back burner too long and then have Microsoft move this up in the patches. And if you're familiar with your server teams, you know that they're always kind of juggling all kinds of stuff coming from Microsoft for these patches. It's very easy for something like this to kind of fall through the cracks and surprise you. So now let's look at InforOS, and I'm tailoring some of this from specifically from what I would call a legacy Lawson perspective. So those of you who are still on V10, or maybe are in a V10 hybrid environment, maybe you have GHR or you have CSF, but you're still using V10 for maybe payroll or maybe supply chain. InforOS provides a lot of value to V10 clients, and I think we get we don't get quite as much focus from the Infor sales teams or marketing teams related to InforOS, because that's a big push for the multi-tenant V11 cloud. And there's not always a ton of attention paid to those folks who have decided for one reason or another that they need to stay on V10 or they need to stay on premise. Most of you who are V10 and on premise are still using an older version of Ming.le. Most of you are using Ming.le 11. That's based on SharePoint, and it's a bit of a kludgy tool. And when that got included in the product suite for us legacy Lawson users, there was a lot of confusion about what purpose did this actually serve for Lawson users. A lot of you know it as a navigation layer that fit around your Lawson portal or your GHR web UI, and didn't pay a ton of attention beyond that, because a lot of the features weren't really tied in or weren't created in a way that made a lot of sense for us Lawson folks. There's a good reason for that. Ming.le and InforOS are products that are meant to tie together the entire Infor ecosystem. Obviously, there's a lot of products in that ecosystem, not just Lawson and Landmark and GHR and S3 and those things that we're really familiar with. And so when Lawson got kind of rolled into that and put under that Ming.le umbrella, there was a little bit of confusion about how exactly to best utilize it. And I apologize. You can probably hear my dog going off as the mailman walks by my house right now. I apologize. But now in the new version of InforOS, Infor has really done a lot of work to roll out really impressive features that have a big impact on us that are still using Lawson on premise. Now, the big thing is it replaces Ming.le with a newer version that is HTML5 standard compliant. So it runs much smoother in a much wider array of web browsers. It's actually maybe the first truly unified web experience that I've seen in the Lawson world. Even those of us who are used to old Portal, there were problems when Internet Explorer would release a new version. Then there were problems when Chrome would release a new version, and that was because that wasn't always HTML standard compliant. Well, the new InforOS is. That also means that if you're using it from a mobile browser on your phone, it's really slick. It looks the same way. It's optimized for mobile. But beyond just Mingle, there's a ton of other really important features in InforOS, and there's a huge they call it a tech stack, a technology stack that makes up InforOS, and there's a ton of stuff in there. But there's a few that really matter to the V10 on-premise clients. And those are the Ion integration engine. I'm calling it an integration engine. Infor doesn't really brand it that way, but I think that's the easiest way for us in the Lawson world to think of it. It introduces home pages. So these replace some of what you probably know as landing pages or customized Mingle pages. It also introduces InforOS as STS, a new authorization and authentication methodology. And like I said, mobile optimization. So from a mobile browser, it looks a lot better, but also there are some new iOS and Android apps that are really fast, really slick, and work really, really well. So if you're used to trying to use some of the older ESS tools for Lawson Portal that were mobile, those got the job done. But these new tools are really, really well done and really slick. So, like I said, for a lot of us, the big thing is that InforOS is going to replace Mingle. So you can see in this sort of architecture diagram, this is probably what a lot of your environments sort of look like. You might have Lawson System Foundation, you might have Landmark Runtime also. You've got probably a shared database server. Maybe you're using a web server to provide some external access to Lawson System Foundation. And then maybe you've even got some other applications in there. Maybe you've got LBI or MSCM or things like that. Well, InforOS just replaces Mingle 11. So in a lot of cases, for a lot of us, the big thing is it's just going to be a new version of Mingle. Even if you don't utilize any of this other functionality, it's just going to be a newer version of Mingle. And end users are going to access it really the same way we were all instructed to with the old version of Mingle. But I know a lot of V10 clients found that for their customers, for their end users, it was a lot easier just to forward them right to Portal. That's kind of the dirty little secret of a lot of V10 clients. We were told we weren't supposed to do that, and that wasn't really a supported model, but Mingle was just a little bit too clunky for us to use like that, and it was a lot easier to kind of do what we knew best, which was use Portal. But the new InforOS is going to work the same way. End users are supposed to access everything in your environment from the InforOS wrapper around all those applications. So a little bit more information about what is happening to Mingle. So like I said, there was a little bit of a surprise as I started putting this presentation together. I had originally geared it towards just talking about what I thought was so cool about the new InforOS features for legacy Lawson clients. But then on October 5th, Infor did release a notification to single tenant hosted clients saying that they will be moving them from the old version of Mingle to the new version of InforOS over the next year. Reason why? Again, it's Microsoft. Microsoft is retiring, I want to say in October of next year, so they've got a year left, but Microsoft is retiring a little known product called Silverlight. And Silverlight is basically a code runtime library that SharePoint was using, or I should say that Mingle was using through SharePoint to run most of the Mingle application. So if you remember that the old version of Mingle is based on SharePoint, you had to have a SharePoint server to get Mingle up and running. Well, that SharePoint server is using Silverlight, and Silverlight's being discontinued. So that's kind of how we got here. Now, Infor is trying to get ahead of that with a lot of their single tenant hosted clients by pushing them to get on InforOS sooner rather than later so that they can stay way ahead of that sunset for Silverlight. So as far as new features go, I think one of the most important ones is what Infor calls Ion. And you've probably heard of Ion already, probably know a little bit about it. If you've been to any of the tech eds or listened to any of the Inforum talks, ION is basically, Infor is calling it Intelligent Open Network. And it's basically a new way for Infor applications across the whole product suite, the whole Infor ecosystem. It's a standardized way for all those applications to talk to each other. So if you are in the multi-tenant cloud or you're familiar with the multi-tenant cloud and you know that there is some user syncing that happens, for instance, maybe if you have GHR and you have Burst and you add a new user in GHR and whoop, there they are in Burst next time you log in. It's ION behind the scenes that's doing all that. And in one sense, you can look at ION just as a tool for those applications to talk to each other using what Infor is calling BODs, but is really just JSON messaging. So for the technical folks, maybe you're familiar with JSON messaging. ION is just an architecture that allows those applications to talk to each other using standardized JSON messaging. But also, ION provides a new way to integrate third-party systems. And in a lot of ways, I think it provides a little bit more flexibility and power than IPA, Infor Process Automation, does. Now that ION is really rolling out and being more widely used, I like to think of ION as a way to get third-party data into your Infor environment, and then IPA is a way to transact some business logic or to automate some business logic against that data. So ION doesn't replace IPA, but it does provide what I think are much better ways to interact with third-party systems that are a little bit easier to manage from the very top level. It also provides something called the ION API Gateway. So I know for a lot of us, again, in the legacy Lawson world, we don't have a ton of exposure to APIs. We don't really use a lot of APIs. Some of you might be utilizing web services through IPA, and that's pretty close, but we've never really had a good model for easily integrating API calls into our environment. And the ION layer in InforOS really changes that, and it really gives a very easy way to begin integrating APIs into the environment. You can see, I didn't want to reinvent the wheel here. There was really no reason to. This graphic really gives all the information you need. This kind of just goes over what makes up ION. And, there's some really, the model behind the scenes, I think, is really cool. The ability for these applications to talk really easily to each other, to use standards compliant calls in and out of the environment to talk with third parties. But also, it's the ION tool set that I think really makes a big difference here. There's a new feature called ION Desk, and that really gives you this spot in the administration pages in InforOS to be able to get the 30,000-foot view of everything that's going on in ION on your system. So you can see applications that are talking back and forth to each other. You can see what those packages of data are, and is GHR sending new user information to Cloud Suite Financials? Is it sending new general ledger information over? You can see that, and when some of those fail for one reason or another, it's a lot easier to find what failed and correct that. Same thing with APIs. You can see in real time the API calls being made in and out of your system, and get a really good sense of if something's going wrong, what is it, drill into it. And you can see that through InforOS, meaning that because it's HTML5, it's standards compliant, you have way more options in getting access to that. So maybe you're on the run and you've got to use your cell phone real quick. Well, like I said, you've got those new InforOS apps, but even if you don't have those apps, if you got to use somebody else's cell phone, you can still load up that page and you can access that. And because it's HTML standards compliant, you have readability and accessibility in a lot more places than you did before. You can't really say that for Infor Process Automation, even though that has come a long way. And now you can use things like the web UI to really easily get into your work units. The ION Desk really provides a really impressive way to stay on top of all that. And if reporting is your thing, you can dig into metrics. You can report on all the data points related to all that. So it really gives you, like I said, that 30,000-foot view of kind of what's being transacted on your system in between all of your different applications that we never really had before. And all that's built on the Ion service, which is a little bit like what I talked about before, the ability for these applications to be able to talk to each other using a set of standards and to third parties using a set of standards. The Ion inbox, which is basically the technology that sits on each application in your environment that lets Ion talk back and forth between them. And the data lake and catalog. And for us on premise, the data lake, I don't think plays such a big part, so I don't get into it here in this presentation, but these other things really do make a big difference. And we'll see that Ion continues to play a part as we start talking through these next set of features. So really all these next features are built on Ion, which I think is really the core, the meat and potatoes of what makes InforOS so cool. So the next thing is home pages. So in this example I show you here, this is what the new Ming.le looks like. You can see it's a little bit cleaner. It's a little bit more consolidated than the old Ming.le. It follows the new Soho 4 controls and color standards and design standards and things like that. But what this does really easily that the old Ming.le never really did is it gives you a very easy way to create really valuable, fully featured home pages. And these home pages exist in the InforOS layer, meaning that they are above all of your other constituent applications. And what that means is using Ion, you can pull in data from all those different applications and you can have them right on your dashboard. Now here in this example, you can see I've kind of got my own little personal dashboard, and I'm looking at some security events here and Ion API calls. But I'm also looking at my GHR admin page and a widget called the Admin Navigator. And from here, I can go look up employees really easily. I can do some employee actions all right in this widget. You can also see over here, I've got a web widget that I can just force load a web page. So you can use that for announcements. You can use that for your corporate intranet. And there is now a huge library of widgets that are delivered by Infor and supported by Infor. Now, most of them are based on the V11 applications. That's it makes sense, but that's where a lot of the Infor development is now. But utilizing the homepage functionality in Ion, you could create on your own widgets for S3 as well. You can use Ion to pull and query data from S3 and present it in widgets that you design. And that tool set is not overly complicated. So that really is a really powerful feature because, like I said, a lot of these come right out of the box, but there's also a great tool set for developing your own and pulling the information you need out of S3 or maybe even out of a whole different third-party system. All you need to do is just get that data in. And like I said, I'm looking at my personal dashboard here, and you can allow your users to create personal dashboards, or you can push out dashboards based on their roles or their functions. You can have multiple dashboards, so I can maybe have my own dashboard, but then also the dashboard that my team pushes down based on my role. So there's a lot of functionality here. Next, I want to talk about InforOS as STS. That might be a little bit familiar for those on the tech side or the system admin side who are probably used to LS as STS, Lawson Security as STS. STS means a secure token service, and that's basically a model for authenticating and authorizing access to your system. So, we talked about how LDAP is the repository that holds all that information, but it's your STS, it's your secure token service that's actually making those calls to the LDAP to authenticate those users. Now, if you are in a pretty typical V11 environment, you might have Lawson System Foundation and you might have Landmark. And those two environments for you are probably what we call federated. And that was a way before InforOS came along for Infor to link up and be able to sync up these two different environments, LSF and Landmark. And if you were federated, most of us used Lawson Security Foundation as the primary authenticating method, meaning that if you went to log into Landmark, Landmark actually passed that call back to Lawson Security to authenticate you and check your roles and see if you really were who you said you were and had the roles you were asking for to be able to access whatever you were trying to access. Um, but Lawson Security had some limitations in that role, namely, it, you couldn't use any other identity provider for your Lawson Security unless you were going through ADFS. That opened the door to a lot of other options, but it kind of complicated things because then your security model started getting really convoluted and really packed in with Lawson Security, ADFS, maybe your Active Directory, maybe a different identity provider tied into your ADFS, and then your Landmark environment, and then it's federated, and you're using ISS for some of that and LSA for some of the rest. It's a little complicated. InforOS as STS really simplifies that, and it brings it all just into InforOS, and it removes the federation piece from these environments. And in this case, let's pretend Infor application 1 is LSF and Infor application 2 is Landmark. Instead of those two applications being tied together and federated and sending information back and forth to each other directly, they're now sending it all up to the Infor STS repository. And so you can manage all that centrally from InforOS. InforOS becomes the authentication provider for all those applications. And so, you get the single sign-on with everything, but also you get the ease of use of using InforOS to manage users. It's a much cleaner interface than getting into ISS or some of the other tools in Landmark and Lawson System Foundation to manage security. And again, because it's web standards compliant, there's a much greater degree of accessibility there. But what I think is really the big deal out of InforOS as STS is that it allows you to use a whole new range of identity providers. So, there are a lot of organizations that might now be using Azure Active Directory or Ping Federate or even Google's identity provider solution to manage their corporate directories. And in the past, you weren't able to easily use those as your authenticating identity provider in the Lawson environment because there was no methodology to tie those things together. Well, now InforOS as STS does that. And so I can have all of my single sign-on based on SAML2, that's an industry compliant authentication methodology. I can have all of my Infor applications with single sign-on provided by a SAML2 industry-supported standard connection to a third-party identity provider like Google. So as a lot of organizations start looking at different cloud options for managing some of what they used to have on premise, this becomes a really attractive option to roll that stuff together and really simplify what the security model looks like. Now, I don't want to be, this isn't alarmist. This doesn't replace things like configuration console and Landmark to be able to manage and detail and change your security roles and classes and things like that. And same with Lawson Security Administrator and the RM Administrator. All that sticks around as ways to manage what the security is defined as in those applications. But what InforOS as STS gives you is a centralized place to manage the users and what roles they have and how that information syncs between each environment. So that's really, really powerful, especially for those folks who were very reluctant to go to the ADFS model, which was the only previously supported model for providing authentication. If you go back a couple years, and for a lot of us, that was a little bit of a pain, especially for us on Unix environments. We didn't want to spin up Windows servers just to run ADFS just so that we could be supported. InforOS as STS really gets us out of having to do that. Next, again, this probably should have been first because everything kind of rolls up under here. But I did want to talk about Ming.le and how this new interface is just much cleaner and more responsive than the old Ming.le that we all just kind of had to put up with. You can see as I go through this animation how easy it is to click between the different applications that are rolled up under my my Infor environment. When I go to that application selector, I know it's a little bit fast, but you can see that there's all kinds of applications in my Infor ecosystem that fall into there. And I'm just really easily switching between both. Single sign-on happens behind the scenes. And you can see it's all a very consistent design. And so when we talk about user training and onboarding new users, we don't have to walk people through completely disparate systems and ways to get the same type of data in different systems. The new Ming.le really simplifies the layout. And now that many of these applications, including the S3 applications in Lawson System Foundation, if you want to update to the very latest and greatest, these all follow the Soho 4, what Infor calls the Soho 4 web controls, which is, like I said, that unified design language for how an application should kind of look and feel. And it really creates a really clean, easy to navigate, easy to describe environment. And you can see as I click through inside of these applications like CSF, how easy it is for me to navigate between the application administrator, between my job functions. It's just, it's much cleaner. Also, like I said, all the benefits that you see here, if you go pull up your InforOS page, say you have it on your phone, it looks almost exactly the same. It's reorganized automatically to fit the size of your phone screen, but it's all the same stuff. It's all the same data. You access it all the same way. So it can be really powerful for those of us who want to utilize the phone a little bit more to be able to stay on top of some of that work. And because I'm a tech nerd, I can't help but mention that one of the greatest parts of new InforOS is that it doesn't require SharePoint. SharePoint was such a bear for a lot of us to manage and install and keep up to date with the old Ming.le, because in the Lawson world, we never had to have SharePoint. And a lot of organizations don't have a dedicated team to SharePoint. So that was a little bit of an onerous restriction for a while, or obligation for us to have to keep up with. And this does away with that. This is now all Infor proprietary software. InforOS runs on what Infor calls the Ion Grid. And the Ion Grid is a really powerful, really time-tested application server. And it's actually what hosts part of what's in the multi-tenant cloud. So it's that same technology as what's being used in the multi-tenant cloud for shared services and hundreds, thousands of clients. And you can now get that on premise. So InforOS is a lot. It's a much bigger thing to chew on than LDAP-to-LDAPS. If you are single tenant hosted, you do really have to start thinking about this, because Infor is going to be asking you to make plans to move to the new InforOS by the end of next year. In some cases, for some clients who didn't really use a lot of Ming.le features, this isn't going to be much. You might not even notice much difference, except that Ming.le looks a little bit better. It's a little bit more responsive. But if you are wanting to leverage any of this new stuff, if you have been waiting to be able to bring in a different identity provider or consolidate identity providers at your organization, and your ERP was one of the reasons you couldn't do that, there's a lot more to think about. So that's the first thing. If you're thinking about going to InforOS, I would use this as a time to think about your identity provider and whether if you've been thinking about moving off to something else, if now is a good time, now that you have more options with your ERP. Then I would clean up security and LSF and Landmark. And again, that's because we're going to be offloading some of that security management to InforOS. So we want to make sure that as we sync up all that data in the InforOS repository, we're syncing up good, clean data. That can sometimes be that can sometimes be a heavy lift, especially for the organizations with a lot of users. There can be a lot to clean up there. And then, of course, if you have any Mingle customizations, I know a lot of clients just tried to avoid Mingle, but there were some clients that really dove in the deep end and started using some SharePoint functionality to really build out their Mingle implementation and make that a little bit more robust. Hats off to the people who have done that and have kind of done the hard work there to really make that work for them. But that's all going away, and there's not a way to migrate that stuff over because this is no longer in SharePoint. So if you do have those customizations, it's time to look at those and really think about, okay, what does this translate to in this new InforOS environment? Am I looking at maybe utilizing home pages? Am I looking at maybe needing to use Infor document management? Another feature of InforOS that we really didn't get into here, but that could replace some of SharePoint's well-known file share and collaboration tools. You know, not mentioned here, but another good opportunity to really think about what does your security model look like? You know, maybe you don't want to move to a new identity provider, but maybe you still want to utilize InforOS as STS, even if it goes back to your Active Directory. And maybe that gives you a good opportunity to start consolidating and simplifying some of what your security model looks like across the board. So that's all planning stuff. From an implementation perspective for InforOS, you're going to have to, if you're fully on premise, now if you're in the single tenant cloud, Infor is going to take care of a lot of this for you. But if you're completely on premise, InforOS is going to mean that you're going to spin up a new server, and it's going to be pretty beefy. InforOS, even though I think from a technical perspective, it's much more lightweight and streamlined. It's got a lot less overhead than the old Mingle did because of all that went into that. There's still a lot going on. You know, even just the features we've talked about, those are really, there's a lot of horsepower behind those features. But you can stand it up next to your Mingle environment. So you can begin to do some of this InforOS work without connecting everything ahead of you turning off that Mingle environment. So, you know, instead of being an in-place upgrade, you can really do those things in parallel and give yourself a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of, you know, time to really test this out before pushing this to be the primary model in your test or your production environment. So I'm even running a little bit later than I thought, but I think there still is a little bit of time for questions. So does anybody have any questions about LDAP to LDAP-S or InforOS from the Lawson perspective? All right, I guess not. If any do come up, you think of anything after the fact, certainly let us know. You can contact us through Brian Waters. That's brian.waters@balesllc.com, and he can get you in touch with myself or Rob Velasco. We'd be happy to help address any questions or concerns here. And I guess with that, Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Jared. That was a great session. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for attending. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we hope you'll consider attending our next scheduled events, which are occurring next Friday. Next Friday, we'll be presenting the following topics. Jared, if you could advance the deck, please. Thank you. The early session will be new talent acquisition. An overview of the new TA module, and then the next slide we'll give an overview of the configuration console with an IPA deep dive. If you're interested in attending any of these and want to register, you can visit our website or email brian.waters@balesllc.com. And as a closing thought, we wanted you to be aware of our Coffee with Consultants offering. If you have any questions about what you saw today or any questions related to anything related to the Infor products, please reach us via our website. We'll connect you with a consultant who will spend a half an hour with you at no charge over coffee or tea or whatever the beverage of choice would be. answering any questions that you may have related to your Infor system. Again, thank you for attending, and we really appreciate you taking the time. Have a great day.